Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. And so we have titled our session Unmuting the Ambiguity of the Middle Caste, a Theological Response. And I like to state right from the outset that I'm very much sharing, like I say, as a South African, from my lived experience and reality. So partially reflecting on just me growing up in the setting of South Africa and how that has impacted this whole lecture. So I would like to just start by just painting a little bit of a picture of the South African context in light of our topic today. So in 2022, the South African theologian Eugene Barron, he titled an article published in an international journal for Black theology, Colored, You Are on Your Own, a dialectic between Biko's Black consciousness thought and the post-apartheid condition of the colored people in South Africa. In his article, he interrogates the misconstrued understanding of how Steve Biko used the phrase, Black man, you on your own. And furthermore, he uses Biko's framework to highlight the marginalization of colored people in the apartheid and apartheid South Africa. Categorization of colored people started long before the official legislation of apartheid in 1948 to 1944, and racial segregation, which classified South Africans in 4 racial groups, namely white, black, Indian, and colored. Before apartheid, colored people were commonly referred to as, in my mother tongue, bruin mense, which is translated in English, brown people. They are known to be a mixture of the indigenous Khoisan people who started mixing with the European settlers starting from 1652 onwards, the Bantu peoples who settled in the southern parts, the Java slaves as well as Indian slaves who were brought to southern Africa. Some authors often write in post-apartheid that people self-identify as colored. However, it is well known that it was a term assigned to all peoples of mixed origin by the dominant group, not numerically, but who held political and social power at the time. That would be the white South Africans. Referring to Usha's first lecture on the Unmuted series, I then take the following description when referring to those who are being muted. Muting or silencing is a social behavior based on the implicit understanding that in society, there are dominant and non-dominant or subordinate groups. There is a collective understanding, whether conscious or subconscious, of who is in power and who is not. Therefore, the colored people of South Africa have been the subordinate group when it came to their assigned social identity, which result in a lot of ambiguity and marginalization at different levels of society. It should also be noted within the racial divisions, there was also hierarchy, perhaps something similar to what we know of the caste system, the Indian caste system as well, which occasionally and also supposedly favored colored people among other groups. I use the word supposedly intentionally because no oppression or dehumanization can be considered as privileged. Furthermore, the imposed identity is not white nor black / African, or more commonly, it's known as you are neither white nor black. Other familiar terms include not white enough, not black enough, which was often used as political tool at the dawn of democracy for political parties to gain their advantage. Another form of marginalization also occurs in the historical and political narratives, as well as where the colored existence, their contribution, and their welfare are often dismissed or referenced as an afterthought. In contemporary South Africa, there is an increased fight from various colored groups to be heard and to unmute the silence of their lived realities as disadvantaged people within the wider society. I would like to shift a little bit. So in South Africa in general, I think we are very familiar with racism. It has been a big part of South African history, and it continues to be a big part of the conversation in South Africa as well. But I want to not focus on racism, of which much has been written about, especially in the South African context, but rather also focus and direct attention more to colorism. And in particular, what colorism looks like amongst this marginalized group as well. Colorism is a concept not as pronounced as racism in South Africa. The racial conversation has long and is still dominating the South African narrative. Yet it is firmly ingrained in our social behavior, that is colorism. According to Robinson and Ward, colorism is described as a prejudicial treatment of people based on their skin tone color variation. Unlike racism, colorism happens inter- and intra-racially. In the previous section, we already alluded to the supposed privilege that colored people received, which could be used as an example of the interracial preference. It is presumed that they were favored by the white party, who was the dominant group during the time of apartheid. They were favored based on their brown skin status, as well as sharing the Afrikaans language used by the Dutch descendants. Much of the behavior and marginalization overlaps with that of social racism. So in light of colorism, I would like to draw attention to its pervasiveness among intra-racial understanding and behavior that takes place within the subordinate group. And within this, I really want to, as a colored person myself, want to give a critique of how we are practicing colorism among this ourselves as a subordinate group. There is quite a paradox trying to box colored people merely based on the color of their skin, which, as stated earlier, was often referred to as brown people. You can find tone spectrum ranging from white looking, Indian looking, Bantu looking, and Khoi looking, at times even Asian looking features. Therefore, at times it was not about being brown skinned that identified you as colored, but it was also associated strongly with the language of speaking Afrikaans, as I already mentioned, which is similar to the Dutch language. Colorism has multifaceted roots in the Eurocentric idea of beauty, the colonial ideologies of white supremacy, and racism externally and internally. At this stage, it is worth mentioning that sadly, these ideologies have been pervasive also within the inherited colonial theology and practice that we find in our Christian communities today. It is therefore common to find within the subordinate group that they regard anything white as clean, pure, and beautiful. And generally, everything black is dark. It symbolizes unclean, ugly, or even less than. This is entrenched in the evangelical preaching and teaching, but it is also expressed in how we view other people. During the formation of one's identity, it is either that you are mocked for being too dark-skinned or having too curly hair or too kinky hair. I remember growing up, I was often told by the elderly people, your aunts and moms in particular, if you eat your vegetables, you will grow long, straight hair, because that was the desired look that was associated, for example, with beauty. Within the South African context, then, the intraracial discrimination and looking down on people with darker skin tones are also translated into the behavior towards those categorized as Black people in South Africa. At times of fear, political tension, or anything going wrong in society, the true belief of how we view the other often comes to the fore, especially as it relates to the skin tone of other people. I would now briefly just like to shift and give some reflections again from a personal experience of also then how this interplays within a global community of faith as well. It would be rather lovely to think that within our global Christian communities, we no longer have to deal with such blatant discriminatory behavior. I have come to realize that the ambiguity of my coloredness is also transferred to each context I find myself, each new context. Firstly, I am often asked by foreigners, are you Zulu or are you Xhosa? These are sort of the more common tribes that are found in South Africa. To which I will answer, no, in South Africa, I am considered colored. Even in the way I'm answering should already tell you I am ready to explain the follow-up question. Many Europeans in particular have answered and said to me, why do you complicate it? Just say I'm Black. In Europe, you will just be Black. Just in that moment, my identity is being muted all over again. Someone else is deciding how I should identify to make it easier for their understanding and for their categorization. This has often been a struggle. Do I then deny my identity that has shaped me strongly, my identity within my colored community and upbringing? Other comments would be that of surprise. For example, oh, but you are not like the typical African. Or, oh, you speak such good English. Or, you are my favorite African. Initially, it sounds like a compliment, but one has to wonder, what do you actually mean? Favorite compared to what? Or to compare to who? What is a typical African?
Awesome.
Why does my speaking English surprise you so much? I am often the... Sorry, can you still hear me?
Perhaps you should just turn off your video so that we will have a better connection.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes.
May I continue?
Yes, please.
Much better.
All right. So I continue. I'm often the only brown-skinned African among many international circles. At times I wonder, am I favored because I'm in many ways lighter toned than the average African? And when I mean lighter toned, I don't just mean my physical skin color, but lighter toned in my expression, in my articulation, in the way I connect and assimilate within the global group as well. All of these reflections then leads me to the problem, which I would like to call like a theological problem. The more I reflect, the more I realize that we find ourselves with a deep theological problem. That is an identity crisis. Now, this may come as a surprise to my fellow colored community, and I'm sure they would confidently tell me how proud they are of who they are. Some may even add on and say they're proud of where they come from. Others may even quote to me that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, or we are made in the image of God, to which I will say amen. Earlier, I alluded to the entrenchment of the racial and color ideologies that also shape theology and Christian behavior. Berger and Laporta share how the AFM Apostolic Faith Mission, a classical Pentecostal church in South Africa, founded in 1908, started among Black, and Black here, all-inclusive Black, so coloreds, Indians, and South African categorization of Black communities in the township areas. And soon these Black workers would go back and share what God was doing to the white people whom they worked for. This meant that the white employers started attending church. At first, it was a celebration and a picture of revelation where every tribe and tongue worshiped the Lord together, and the social rules of segregation did not apply. However, this feeling of heaven soon came to an end when it came to sharing the Holy Communion out of the same cup, or sharing the baptism bath by both Black and white groups. What followed shortly was that the church also instituted the national trend that was separation and segregation of the church into its 4 classified racial groupings, resulting in a white AFM church, a Black AFM church, a colored AFM church, and an Indian AFM church, all operating within their own segregated communities. During the struggle of apartheid, scriptures played an important role in the liberation of Black South Africans. The same Bible that was used as a weapon, believing that Black people are cursed and to be subjugated, also became a liberating tool. It was within theological reflection that the oppressed read the Bible and understood that they too were a people made in the image of God. After apartheid, the church hasn't done enough to cover the not. Within the church world today, and within our still segregated communities and churches, most will recite Genesis 1:26 to 27, that all of us are made in the image of God. Yet in our behavior, we still perpetuate and marginalize people according to how they look, the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, and the way they speak, and at times even where they live. Sadly, in my opinion, the church has not done much to recover the trauma and damage done to the marred identities of many South Africans, and in our case today, as we reflect in particular on the marginalization of the colored communities. Today, the ambiguity of who we are and where we come from remains. The rise and fight for identity continues. The trauma inflicted upon us is also what we inflict consciously and unconsciously upon each other and towards other Black people in particular. What would the church and people look like who truly embrace the truth that each and every one of them are made in the image of God? Colored people are valuable, and their experiences and lived realities matters to God. In God's grand story, He truly redeems all things to Himself. As a people made in His image, how do we reflect the character and the nature in how we treat ourselves and others? Being made in His image did not only give us value, but it also restores our dignity. Unmuting the ambiguity of the colored people calls for a deeper theological reflection and understanding as a people then made in his image. That understanding should ground who we are and also shape how we love, value, and treat one another. Within the global community of believers, it is at times easier for minority groups to conform and assimilate into the new dominant cultures. It is also easier, as in the earlier example, to mute our experiences and our lived realities at the expense of making it easier for the categorization of others. How do we consider the preferences we make and what we say? When it comes to matters of favoritism and tokenism, on the matter of assimilating into integrated cultures within the South African context, it was Steve Biko who was of the opinion that it's not just a matter that we assimilate and that we integrate. If integration happens without really valuing the experience of the oppressed, then it was futile. He therefore said, in his opinion, that it would lead to Black voices being muted, dissolved, or stifled. It needs to go beyond assimilation that does not address the deep issues that people of color are wrestling with. It calls the body of believers to stand in solidarity with those being marginalized and giving space for voices, stories, lived realities to be heard in their own voices. I will pause there. These are some of my reflections as I look at the experience of colored people then being muted in many different ways, and also how that has theological implications, not just for our understanding, but in particular for how we behave and how we move forward in raising a more confident consciousness of who we are in Christ. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. And we will straight away invite Dr. Gigi Khanyezi, who is a trainer, facilitator, educator, healer, and cultural architect who equips faith communities to embody the trauma-responsive work of racial healing and justice. And so I will not do too much introduction, but perhaps she would share a little bit of herself, which connects with the presentation that she will be doing today. So over to you.
Hello, beloved family. On my side of the world, it's morning, so I'm tempted to, it's very early morning, so I'm tempted to say good morning, but I realize it's afternoon for most of you all. So good afternoon and good morning. It really is a joy to be with you, and it is an absolute honor to co-present with my dear sister, Trizenia. Let me just share my screen. All right, are we able to see this?
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So Trizenia has laid a beautiful foundation for unmuting the ambiguity of the middle caste, a theological perspective. So I want to give you an idea of where we're heading just in the next 12 or 13 minutes that you are in my hands, where we're headed. So number one, I'm going to give you a glimpse into my story. And then we're going to look at my story first through the lens of race, and then through the lens of theology, and then through the lens of the muted group theory. And then we'll wrap up by bringing them all together. So that is little itty bitty me. I grew up in East Oakland, California. For those who do not know the US context, Oakland is a city with incredible legacy in terms of the struggle for civil rights, and in particular, racial justice. It is where the Black Panther Party was birthed in 1966. I was born 10 years later in 1976. My dad is a Brazilian immigrant, so he was born and raised in São Paulo, Brazil. And my mother was born and raised Amish, which racially is white. So I grew up half Brazilian, half white, a brown little girl in a predominantly Black inner city, lower income community in Oakland, California. And if I had to say what was probably the most defining factor of my life growing up and into adulthood, it was and is color. Probably the single most common question that I have been asked my entire life from the time I was very small is, excuse me, I just have to know, what are you? I mean, strangers in the parking lot, people, someone at a gas station, someone at a grocery store, people in church. I mean, if I can say, the entitlement of us needing to know what category you fit in. There's a reason why we do that, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But I grew up a brown little girl in East Oakland, predominantly Black neighborhood. When I was 12 years old, already, you know, growing up in that environment, I was 12, probably going on about 22, already very passionate, very aware of social dynamics, racial dynamics. My family split up. My mother moved me to a city only 12 miles away. It was called Castro Valley. It was only 12 miles away, but family, it might as well have been on a different planet, because I had grown up in a space that was predominantly Black with some diversity of brownness and a little bit of whiteness. Castro Valley was at the time 99% white. And what I learned on my third day of school is that it was filled with the KKK. The KKK stands for Ku Klux Klan. I'm sure most of you are aware of the history of the KKK being probably the single most notorious, brutal, violent white nationalist group in US history. On the third day of school, as a new child who didn't know anyone, I came to school and there was KKK spray painted in red all over the school. And what I came to find out was that happened about 2 or 3 times a year, every year that I was in school. I was heckled by the KKK. I was one of the only brown students of 2,000 kids in my high school. We had one Black teacher. She, at least once or twice a year, she had death threats written in letters and slid under her door. So I went from one extreme of inner city East Oakland to the opposite extreme of 99% white Castro Valley, where I was targeted as other. In East Oakland, I was one of us. In Castro Valley, you are one of them. And so, as you can imagine, I spent most of my free time outside of school and sports back in Oakland, where I felt at home. As I grew up, I went to college. I eventually went to seminary. At Denver Seminary, I did a master's of divinity with an emphasis in intercultural ministry. And in pretty much all of my classes, I was either the only or at least one of the only brown bodies in the room, people of color in the room in any of my classes. I was also either the only or one of the only women in my classes. And so much of my life has been defined by my brownness, identified as othered in this context. But then in 2008, there was a dramatic turn in my life because I relocated to Soweto, South Africa. And I ended up living there and serving there for 10 years. What I could not have anticipated in relocating to Soweto was that was the racial landscape and where I fell in the hierarchy. After spending 30 years in the United States as a brown woman and being marginalized as such and doing a grassroots justice work from a faith-based perspective as a brown woman, I suddenly showed up in South Africa, specifically in the townships. Soweto is the largest township, which by definition is 100% Black. And I was viewed as white, 100% white. Like I might as well have been blonde hair and blue-eyed kind of white. There was no context for Latin American brown, because in the US, we border Latin America and Mexico, right? South Africa does not. So there is not a context to understand this being Latina. So in the township, I was viewed as 100% white. In the cities and the suburbs, I was viewed as colored. And I was treated totally differently depending on where I was because of how I was perceived. Family, this is the myth of race. This is the experience of being racially ambiguous in the context of a racial hierarchy. This was during my years in South Africa. These are some of the young people that I worked with. Probably the greatest joy and greatest honor of my life. I had the joy and privilege to foster and adopt two amazing boys, Jericho and Judah. There they are. So I want to look at my experience through the lens of the construct of race. So when we talk about race, we know that it's a construct. It doesn't actually exist apart from the social meaning that humans have given to it. So the function of race, let's talk about the function for a minute. The function of race, really the construct of race started with one intention, and that was to make sure that one small group at the top maintained all of the power and all of the wealth, and everyone else did not. The construct of race as we know it today it's a belief system literally manufactured in order to justify the enslaving of melanated bodies, particularly bodies of African descent and indigenous descent as well, but particularly of African descent. So the whole the root system underneath the manufacturing of what we call race today was about one thing. It was always about one thing: power and wealth, and how intertwined those two are. The question then became, so how are we going to control? Race was always about control. We're going to control by dehumanizing. So in order to justify our enslaving of Black bodies of African descent, we are going to dehumanize them. We're going to regard them as less than human, and we're going to create a crisis of identity by pitting other castes against each other. So if that was the function of race, what was the system that it created so that it could maintain that power? If you've ever heard of Isabel Wilkerson, she wrote an incredible book called Caste about 2 years ago. If you have not read it, I really encourage you to read it. It is paradigm shifting. And she identifies the United States as a caste system alongside that of India and that of Nazi Germany. And part of the significance of identifying race as caste is that it's unmoving. You can't move from one caste to another. And really identifying it as caste, it shakes us out of this subconscious socialization that race is just a part of the system and the water that we swim in every day. It's just normal. When we realize it's actually a caste system, we begin to understand the gravity of the devastation. So race created a caste system in order for a very small group to stay at the top. And in order for it to be a caste system, every person needs to fit neatly and cleanly into a racial category, because that category determines how much humanity you have. In other words, the darker a person's skin is, the less human they are. The closer to being identified as African descent, the less humanity they have, and therefore, the less they need to be treated as humans. That means we must be able to fit every person into categories so that we know where we are in the hierarchy compared to them, which is why I've been asked my whole life, excuse me, I just have to know, what are you? We have to fit in categories in order for the system to work. And you can see this in our language, right? Pun intended, it's literally black and white. In our racialized language, people of African descent, we generally, in the Western world, call them black. People of European descent, we call them white. But what about all the other people groups? We generally don't call them by a color. People of Asian descent, we don't call them by a color. People of indigenous descent, we generally don't call them by a color. It's just black and white. So what does that mean for the middle? The middle caste. Our very existence discredits the construct of race. If I can be one race in the US, a different race in the cities of South Africa, and a different race in the townships of South Africa, that exposes the foolishness that we call race today. And it complicates the conversation about race because it's no longer black and white. All right, the lens of theology. So Genesis 1, I want to start here at Genesis 1, which really lays the groundwork for understanding God's design for all of creation. And I want to look at 3 Hebrew words, and I realize I'm going to go through these quickly because time is short. If you want to dive deeper into this, Lisa Sharon Harper has written a brilliant book called The Very Good Gospel. Another great resource is Miguel de la Torre and his commentary on the book of Genesis. So the Hebrew word selem, my dear sister Trizenia has already spoken about this. We translate it as image. So we know from Genesis 1 that all of humanity is made in God's image. Secondly, the Hebrew word radah. Probably the best, or arguably the best translation of that word is dominion. Sometimes it's translated as leadership. Many experts translate it as stewardship, which I appreciate the most because it captures the nuance of the Hebrew word. But it's basically referring to every human being was designed with the capacity and the call to exercise dominion, which that's agency. Influence, being able to influence and have agency over the world around us and our own life. And lastly, tov me'od. So it's translated as very good. If you remember in the creation narrative, 6 times after every day of creation, God declared it good. And after God created humanity, he then declared it tov me'od, very good. But the thing is about the Hebrew phrase tov me'od, it's not referring to the things created as very good. It's referring to the ties between the things created, which means relationships. What God declared very good at the dawn of creation was that he created it all to function in harmony. The relationships were in harmony. And when you look at these 3 things, God's design for creation, the construct of race undermines all 3 of them. Intensely undermines all 3 of them. It dehumanizes anything other than the top caste. It takes away, it diminishes, it undermines the ability of various people groups to fully exercise dominion or influence or agency, and it devastates relationships. And lastly, just as a note, I realize we're running short on time here. Most of us, we don't capture the nuances of the New Testament because we don't understand the hierarchy that Jesus existed in. I'll give you 2 examples. The woman at the well. The woman at the well was a Samaritan. Jesus was a Judean Jew. So both of them were colonized by the Roman government, which means both of them were oppressed. However, in their oppression, they occupied 2 different places in the hierarchy. Jesus was higher in the social hierarchy than the woman at the well, first of all, because he was Judean and she was Samaritan, and second of all, because he was a man and she was a woman. We will miss the deeper meanings of that text if we don't understand the social hierarchy that they existed in. Secondly, Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. So he was a Jew, but he was working for the Romans, the colonizers, and he was exploiting his own people as a result of that, which is why the peoples were so infuriated that Jesus was spending time with him. We've got to understand the power dynamics and the hierarchy that Jesus was living in if we want to understand how Jesus resisted hierarchy and oppression. Lastly, the lens of muted group theory. I'm just going to go through this quickly. As we've already heard, muted group theory is about controlling the conversation and even controlling the existence of groups of people. But the key to understanding it is power. So the perspective of the colonizer, us who are racially ambiguous in the middle caste, we are viewed by the colonizer or the top racial caste. When we serve their purpose, when we align with whiteness or the dominant culture, then we may be unmuted to a degree because we are serving their purpose. When we align with the dominant culture, we also disempower the bottom caste. So the middle caste has a bit of privilege. From the perspective of other castes, the lighter you are, the more power you have because of the nature of hierarchy, which often makes us in the middle despised by the lower caste. That's exactly what the highest caste wants. That's exactly what dominant culture wants. Because if we turn on each other, we will never rise up and take the power back. This is what colorism is rooted in. We have internalized our own oppression as a way to survive. Basically, we mute the existence that challenges the validity of race, the very existence of the middle caste, the very existence of racially ambiguous people challenges the validity of race. And lastly, this verse is a common one that we often hear used in ways that are often very trite. So Galatians 3, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Experts in New Testament, and particularly in the realm of justice, we look at this passage and we do not see Paul suggesting that we ignore differences. We do not see Paul suggesting that we make our differences invisible. We see Paul highlighting power dynamics. Jew and Greek. One group has more power than the other. Slave or free, one group has more power than the other. Male and female, one group has more power than the other. We suggest that what Paul is addressing here are power dynamics, and the construct of race in which colorism is rooted is always about power. So unless we are decolonizing the power dynamics when we read scripture and in how we do ministry and move through the world, we're not actually representing the gospel of Jesus.
Thank you very much. And yes, okay, thank you very much, Gigi, and also Trizenia. We will now start our discussion, and I would like to just open the floor to the audience, those on Zoom and also in the hall, to address the question or make a comment to address the question to both, either one of you, whoever they wishes, and also to make any comments. Yes, I see Wes very excitedly and impatiently raising his hand. So Wes.
I have many questions, but I'll just start with one, I guess. When it has to do with the difference between muted group theory and critical race theory, which is really unclear to me. So if you bring in the concept of caste and you're dealing with structural issues, wouldn't that be more in the critical theory side of things rather than muted group theory, which has more to do with language? maybe I'm missing something, and you can explain the difference between those two, and perhaps if critical race theory is actually what you're doing. I'm not sure.
Is that a question for me?
To either one of you, sorry.
Trizenia, you want to entertain that first? I can follow you. Oh, you're muted, sister.
Muted.
This is the theory.
You're muted, Trizenia.
Maybe she's struggling. Gigi, go ahead. You can get started if you want to. Then Trizenia can jump in.
Yeah. Well, muted group theory, I don't think it's limited. It's not limited to language. It's speaking about a group of people's ability to express itself. And we express ourselves in many more ways than just language. Some of the most important ways we express ourselves, it could be argued, are not with words, but it's how we move through the world, and how we are embraced as having an equal right to have an existence, to have our own culture, to be our own personhood, our own collective personhood. And muted group theory argues that part of the dominant, part of the dynamics of a hierarchical society is that the dominant culture gets to determine who has the right to have an existence, who has the right to have their own culture. And I mean this collectively. What group of people has the right to have their own voice, have their own culture, and have the freedom to express it, right? In terms of critical race theory, that is a massive question that you're asking, that in this context, I can't really go into detail, but I will say this, that that has become a, for lack of a better phrase, that has become a trigger phrase for discrediting any dialogue around race. And so for invalidating and discrediting any dialogue around race, I heard one expert put it this way: another way to state critical race theory is actual American history. Actual American history. And the fact that what we know throughout history is the moment that lower castes of people, particularly people of color, begin to name the reality of racism in society, it gets discredited immediately. That is the history of the Western world. And in my context, that's the history of the United States. So calling every racial discussion critical race theory and then discrediting critical race theory, it's just another way to do that. Most of the time, it's just another way to discredit and invalidate dialogue around the realities of race. In terms of caste, understanding, and again, these are there's no way I can adequately address these three concepts that you named. They are massive. But you rightly named caste talking about structure, although it's not only about structure. Creating a caste system is, as I said earlier, it's the means by which the dominant culture maintains control. It's the means by which we do it. It's the ways that we have made it structural and interpersonal both. Trizenia.
All right, sorry, I am freezing and my screen. So yeah, I think, I would like to also agree that muted group theories, they're not about just language per se. I think, especially if we refer back even to Usha's first lecture, in how she ran through the experience of conversion, for example, right? And just the subtlety of how there's so many different levels of muting that takes place. That includes both language, but it includes behavior, it includes practice, it includes your cultural origins and identifying within your particular culture as well. So in that regard, I definitely think being muted is in a broader scope than just physical vocabulary and language that you do use. And yes, with critical race theory, again, yeah, on this side, on the receiving side of people that are encountering and interacting race in our lived realities, I think there is a contentiousness whenever critical race theory comes to the forefront. And it comes to the forefront because it undermines and it challenges often the structural implications that the effects of race is still having on most of our lived realities and experiences today as well. So the focus was certainly that I feel comfortable that within muted theory, there is space to articulate the marginalization of the groups that we referred to today. Hope that helps.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And is there anyone else? I don't see. Yes, Regina.
I have some comments to make actually, but first of all, I in no way condone any efforts by any group that would dehumanize, oppress, or in any way marginalize people. I think it's completely antithetical to God's purpose for all people, right? I also want to say though that I think a lot of this human systems of any kind are prone to evil and are prone to be abused because they're a result of the curse and the fall. And so to some extent, there are two things I felt like you were saying. One is we categorize people because of race and because of skin color. And of course, in any Christian context, we see the evil behind that and the pain that you must have felt. And for that, I'm very sorry that you have experienced that. I think though that there's some danger when we are trying to deconstruct these social categorizations that take place, because we tend to end up doing the same thing in our argument against the concept of, let's say, racism, because then we categorize everybody who does that into one group. And the danger is we're overgeneralizing in any case. And we want to be careful with that, because obviously individuals in any of those so-called categorizations don't necessarily agree with that or would practice that or believe that. Now, to some extent, I think that social categorization is a cognitive limitation. We have no capacity to actually take in every aspect of every person and every situation and everywhere we meet someone. So we naturally have a cognitive limitation and we categorize people, and that's stereotyping. Now, I think the part that you're bringing out, which is really the part that's very reprehensible, is that we also take that cognitive limitation and we start dehumanizing people in that group. And I think you both did an excellent job in presenting the ugliness of what happens because of skin color. And I appreciate what you've shared with us today, because I think to some extent we are all categorized. If it's not by color, it's by other conditions. And so I can't experience your experience. I can't experience what you've gone through. And I don't try to compare experiences. So what you shared is very valuable. We need to learn from it. We need to do better as human beings. And I think this is the conversation to help that to begin. So thank you very much. Thank you for letting me share my comments.
Yeah, Usha.
Thank you, Trizenia and Gigi, for a very deep personal look at not just muted group theory, but in the ambiguous places that you both find yourselves in. And as followers of Christ here, as Christians, it seems to me that the structures that we maintain within Christian practice often rely on a tradition of repetition, if you like, in order to keep those places narrow. And so the idea of opening up to the possibilities that we could be wrong is painful for everyone involved. So in my opinion, muted group theory offers a place for deep engagement, which requires a level of humility that perhaps critical race theory doesn't seem to hold. So could you, Trizenia, would you, from your experience, especially because you are in a live mission situation, correct me if I'm wrong, you're on a ship right now.
Yes.
Am I right? Yeah. So you're actually very live and in this moment, okay? Where you're living with muting, and yet here you are at Oxford Centre for Mission Studies being unmuted, right? So could you just speak to that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I think, Usha, you are right. I think for me, reflecting, and that's why a starting point was also, we often talk, right, about the experience done to us, and we look at it from the outside, right? And in the South African case, it's the whole racism that we've experienced. But that's why it was a crucial part for me also to be critical about our own behavior as believers and followers of Jesus, and within our subordinate group as well, where we continue to perpetuate the behavior, the systems, the structures, the inherited theological ideology that was attached with our formation as well. But I think also in terms of reflecting even in the space that I occupy now, right? Because we are saying that it's actually within each new context, you are confronted with this ambiguity again, about who you are, where you place yourself, how you express yourself, when do you speak, how do you speak. So all of these things becomes, how do you say, I don't know, do I say subconsciously or even consciously, it comes to a fore when you are engaged in this environment again. I think a big part of my role here, being on the ship at this moment, is also part of orientating the ship's community to African culture, to African perspective, to African theological thoughts and understanding. And even in that, you realize this tension of the two different worlds, a world that is often narrated by the outside about our own perspectives, right? Our own theology, our own Christianization. Here I am now trying to unmute our own voice and our own perspective of how we are experiencing God on the continent, and how we want then this global community to come and engage in this way and in this manner. So yes, it requires, I think, humility. It requires an honesty in owning our realities and being authentic in it. And what are we working towards when we talk about unmuting, right? And I think it is this heart and desire, like you say, we want to create a platform where we can have open and honest discussion, where again, whether it is, yes, we're making one another aware, or yes, we are making one another more sensitive to the realities, but how do we move forward as we are learning in humility from one another and moving forward, but also by intentionally esteeming God's people in whichever context and setting we find ourselves. So that is a bit of the experience, just in a very practical way, that I am finding on board at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, with Wes.
Yes, please, Chen.
Okay, good one.
Thank you so much for your excellent lecture, and I cannot agree with you more, because often I am regarded as others. And for example, last night I filled out a form and I have to choose my own ethnic identity. I cannot see my ethnic identity there, so I take others. Anyway, when you talk about the middle caste, it seems that you are mainly talking about people's ethnic identity. But do you include the cultural identity of people? Because I can see heavy God here. He looks like a Western person with a white color, but he was brought up in Zimbabwe. So if you look at his cultural behavior, he's more like an African person. So there is a kind of discrepancy between his ethnic identity and cultural identity. Now, how do you reconcile that in the concept of middle caste?
Trizenia, you want to start?
Anyone.
Okay, I'll start. And yes, it's an interesting one, right? But just maybe let me give you also an interesting one from this cultural perspective or colored perspective in particular. So there is also contention within the colored identification, because one, remember, in the presentation, it has been one that has been ascribed. So literally it has been a construct, right? A social construct. And so the question is, biologically, we cannot say we are a colored people. You know, technically that does not really work, because we are this mixture and this makeup of everything. And so within our South African context and reality, we often hear these things, like I said, you're not white, you're not black, and colored people don't have culture. But then I think we are contesting to say, irrespective of where we land in the space of neither or, the ambiguous space, irrespective of where we land, we do have a cultural identity, and that we can identify with strongly. So even for me as well, you know, if we have to trace the lines, even in my parents, we can go up to, like, we are the fourth generation. They know up to their grandparents. Beyond that, we don't know our ethnic lines in a clear way, if I make sense. But yet I can identify in the culture, behavior, belief, etc., moving forward. So yes, I don't know how you would describe or assign the Zimbabwean, but yes, that is just maybe my input. I don't know, Gigi.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to engage, and the reason for that, or one main reason for that, is because, again, it adds nuance to the conversation around race, which race was designed to be very black and white, right? We assign people in categories so that the group at the top stays at the top. And when you introduce some of these nuances, it complicates the conversation. So I do think it's really important to have dialogue around the differences between ethnicity and culture. And at the same time, as we have those dialogues, we also, if we want to be a part of dismantling the systems that cause harm, we also have to be able to acknowledge where there is still privilege and unjust power. So even though for a white-bodied person, they may be culturally Zimbabwean, and that changes the way they move through the world, it changes the way they engage with people, it changes their whole worldview. And there is a lot to be said about that. That is unique. And at the same time, in a system that is literally founded on racial hierarchy, they are still a white body, which means the system still benefits them.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you. Andrew, Sterling, and then Brian, and then Daniel, in that order. Andrew.
Okay, thank you. This is a question really for Trizenia. And Trizenia, I grew up in Cape Town in the 1970s and went to UCT. Sien my Afrikaans nie so goed is nie, so I will address you in English. I have an observation, and living, as you know, with the tensions of racial distinction in the Western Cape, particularly during the apartheid era, there was always a question, and I was studying with theologians at UCT and at Rhodes. We had the issue of those who are from colored communities like Desmond van der Water and Bruce Theron and Pa Hufke and others. And there was really this tension as to whether or not they fully embraced Black theology and the extent to which they could identify with James Cone, whether they could identify with being Black, and therefore, in a sense, fixing their sails to the Black theology movement, or whether they maintain a distinctiveness and a uniqueness that was culturally, linguistically, and sometimes geographically different. So how does one today, for example, as a person who is seeking, and I agree with you completely, by the way, of being unmuted, of recognizing your own origins, by recognizing your own distinctions, how do you address and have dialogue with the notion of Black theology, and are you comfortable fitting within that moniker?
Mm-hmm. A very good question, Andrew. Thank you for that and your comments as well. I think, yes, it's very interesting. The paper I referenced in the beginning that I said was by Eugene Barron, a local South African theologian, where he's engaging with Biko's idea of Black man, you on your own, which is basically also Biko's framing and understanding of Black consciousness that also arose around this time of the 70s, right? I think in there it is this, again, this contention and the fight between the categorization, because like Gigi, I think for Biko was the acknowledgement, for example, that the categorization served a political purpose, right? To power and to perpetuate. And the call was, and why I said Barron is addressing it, because he's trying to correct the misconstrued idea that Biko was inciting violence against the political power in power, but instead it was calling for this united and solidarity within Blackness, right? And in saying and creating, therefore, the Black consciousness to say, Black person, you can be proud of who you are and where you come from. And so I think even with Black theology, then, so in terms of how do you categorize yourself, there is then this tension and divide within South Africa, even today, and more so probably in the 70s, it was stronger because a lot of the colored people identified as Black because they were fighting in the struggle as Black, and even especially theologians in particular, right? But then it is in the post-apartheid where it was almost this gameplay of you're not white, you're not quite Black either. And so now you find a colored community that is divided, some that strongly identify in their Blackness. You have some that say, okay, I'm colored, this is all I know. You have some that even makes claim to their European heritage, even though their skin may be darker than mine. And you have some that could not be bothered. But I think Black theology as a whole, it provided a space, a liberating space, where it allowed for engagement with some of these theological and contextual issues that often sort of mainstream theology did not engage with, or sort of, how do you say, minimized to some extent. So yeah, I think it is a balance of where people fall, but I think Black theology definitely provided a liberating space where people could engage in discourse, and therefore really associate also or challenge the mainstream that didn't take the context into reality. Right.
Very good. Thank you, Brian.
Yes, my work is with the Intercultural Church, and my research is also on case studies of intercultural churches in a neighborhood that is 150 cultures all in one place, 50,000 people, 150 cultures. I'm working on the insight of the difference between enculturation and acculturation. The enculturation develops the care of myself and my culture. The acculturation affects the function with which I work with the rest of society. I love your definition of the muted theory, in that in the intercultural churches that I'm observing, there is a normal placement of whoever's in that church of being the other, but included in the group as equal. And sharing the responsibility and the gifts that God has given. And I'm wondering, as far as just how you perceive this colored perspective, which I haven't done a lot of thinking about it, as the neutral place where friendship can overcome prejudice. It seems like a natural place for that to take place. In fact, all of the leaders of these intercultural churches that I'm studying are people of different colors and accents. And they share leadership with others of diverse backgrounds. And they seem to be working it out, not all the time, but on a regular basis, they seem to be working it out. Any comments on that?
To any one of us, Gigi?
If you want to start, I can follow you.
I think, again, maybe to recall the earlier point, I definitely think with multicultural churches, there is a massive opportunity for us, again, to recover God's intent and God's heart and even stewarding, you know, how we relate to others, how we relate to one another. So I definitely think within multicultural church, there is a massive opportunity. In I think one of my critiques to the South Africa, still living in our segregated communities. So after about 17 years, I moved back now to my home and community. Now your church is in that community. The school is there, the shop is there, the doctor is there, the dentist is there. There's no need for our people to cross the barriers unless they go to work or unless they go to shopping mall. Right? So that does not allow the church also space to practice one anothering. And especially in as regards to, you know, to how we treat each other on the basis of race and colorism and all these sorts of things. So I do think there's a huge potential in multicultural churches. However, I want to add the point I raised again about, again, it's a Biko point that Baron highlights, right? To say that it's not just merely about integration. Because what happens now with me being in my global space, and I'm now observing some of our Africans who are now new into this space, and seeing that it's so easy to assimilate, right? It's easy to speak the dominant language, to behave in the way of the dominant culture. And so that then even though we all get along, which is beautiful, but we don't create an opportunity to engage honestly and to live our authentic identities in this space. I would say congregations are opening a way as a possibility. That is great, but how can we be even more intentional? Because we have to also challenge our theological frameworks, which will then inform our behavior and our patterns as well, not just in the church community, but in society at large. That is my comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question to wrestle with, and there's layers in it that I'll try to keep this brief. But on one hand, a multicultural church, as my sister has just said, it's an incredible opportunity, right? We know we have a glimpse from Scripture of what heaven is going to look like. People of every tribe, nation, and tongue. A multicultural church might look like that. Aesthetically, it might look like that. So it's an incredible opportunity to move closer to what we are meant to be praying. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? However, there is also grave danger in multicultural faith communities. And that is that those who are a part of the dominant culture, in most cases in the Western world, that we're talking about the white-bodied community, we have been socialized to believe that we have a voice, our voice matters, that it should be heard, that we are valued and valuable, that we are the standard by which everything else is measured. And most of that is subconscious. We live that out every day from our subconscious belief systems. Whereas the majority world, or people of color, we have been socialized for generations to believe that we are less valuable or not valuable, that we shouldn't have a voice, that we don't necessarily deserve to be listened to. That's how we're socialized. So for the 25 years that I've been doing this work and doing facilitating in spaces, one of the primary ways that I see this dynamic playing out is that when it is in a multiracial space in particular, so there's a difference between multiracial and multicultural, right? Particularly when you're in a multiracial space, what happens almost without fail is that the white-bodied siblings in the room will often interrupt, but you will almost never hear the people of color interrupting. And that has to do with our socialization. That has to do with the beliefs that we have deeply subconsciously internalized. And so what ends up happening in these multiracial and potentially multicultural spaces is that if we are not all doing our own work collectively in our people groups, as well as individually, particularly the dominant group culture, then that same social dynamic of oppression and colonization is going to play itself out in a multiracial or multicultural church. And that is gravely dangerous because it ends up continuing to mute voices. Now, you asked about friendships. So being Brazilian, I am highly relational, like the very marrow of my bones is relational. I thrive in relationship. So I move toward the side of you see change based on relationship. However, you have to realize as well that that puts the burden of labor for change on the people of color. It puts the burden of labor for change on the people of color. So if we have a white community that thinks change is going to happen and they're going to change based only in relationship, you're going to find a bunch of people of color that are exhausted, that are burned out, and won't be able to continue long term. However, if you have a white-bodied community that is doing their own work on their own with each other, reading books together, watching documentaries together, having the hard conversations together among each other, where they're really honestly with deep vulnerability, looking for ways to identify how we are perpetuating harm. If that is happening simultaneously to trying to cultivate healthy relationships with people of color, now that's brilliant. But most of the time, that's not what's happening. And I think the last thing I want to say, this is a really important question. I appreciate you raising it. The last thing I want to mention about how a multiracial, multicultural church can become harmful. And I would say, in my experience, 25 plus years of doing this work, more often than not, it is harmful for the people of color in the room, in the space, is that for those of us, and I use us, the proverbial us, right? Because I'm brown, but those of us, but I lived 10 years being assumed to be white, and it changed me. It changed me. And I'm going to use my own story as an example. When I was in Soweto, the first 2 years, every time I was identified as Mlungu, which is Zulu for white person, I would say, I'm Mlungu, I'm not a white person. And then I would explain all the reasons that I'm not white. My dad's from Brazil. I grew up brown. I've never had maids. I grew up in East Oakland. I give all these reasons. And in my mind, I was thinking, I'm building rapport. I'm building a sense of equality if they see where I've come from. But what I was actually doing is trying to make a case for how I'm different than all the other white people. I'm the exception. I'm the exception. And unfortunately, that is what tends to happen in white-bodied communities. We don't want to identify as part of the problem. And as our sister shared earlier, that there wasn't a question, so we didn't really engage it, but saying, you know, that we're generalizing, and there are some of us who do not agree with that kind of oppression. I would agree with you. However, there is a real danger in planting our feet in that space, because there is an unwillingness to decolonize how we're moving through the world. There's an unwillingness to introspect about how I and my group of people are continuing to cause harm. And that actually has to do with neuroscience, believe it or not. I did my doctorate in healing racial trauma, healing generational racial trauma. And that has to do with neuroscience. One part of our brain is like, I'm so against racism and discrimination that therefore I cannot be associated with any of that. Therefore, that makes the other side of my brain distance myself from any way that I might be held accountable for the harm that we have caused. There's an inability to be held accountable and to actually do the work to bring change.
Thank you very much. We will have the last comment or question from Daniel Murphy, and that will be the last. Daniel.
Yeah, hey guys, thank you very much for this presentation. Yeah, thank you a lot. It's good stuff. It's stuff that I've been thinking through for well over 10 years. I was in St. Louis when Mike Brown was murdered and participated in the protests there. And our church hosted several of the meetings that met in fellowship there. And anyways, one question I have is as I've kind of been on my own journey, is this concept of whiteness. And partly I have to admit, it's a reaction against part of my frustration with the rhetoric in the colored community or Black community, especially communities like Pass the Mic that you may be familiar with, that seem to ascribe whiteness without any sort of discipline. And I realize I'm projecting my own categorization here, but whiteness becomes basically anything that is caricaturized as evil or bad or oppressive, to the extent that you know, we're not going to study any Western theology because it's all white, or we're not going to study Aristotle or Plato because they're white. I mean, I've heard this in person from people of color. And so I think my question is, did whiteness become more salient after CRT's growth in popularity, or at least study of CRT, and in the desire to basically provide nuance or to kind of address colorism, does the interlocutor of white or white-bodied people reinforce colorism, in the sense that it doesn't allow for nuance and getting to know our own personal stories? And just a practical example, I was with one of my dear brother's Black brother, and I just said, you know, what should I do with this regard, with this question? He said, you got to get to know your own past and your own history, and get to know who you are. And I'm a immigrant of German descent as well as Irish descent, and so I got to know my own past. But still, there's this question of, okay, where in the system, the stratification, do I fit? And at what point am I white? At what point am I German, Irish, second gen, third gen assimilated American? I'm serving overseas, in which case I'm not called white, but foreigner, Nangajata, which is its own kind of reified category here. Yeah, so just your thoughts and reflections on that.
Yeah, anyone?
Open, or anyone, or
Both of you, either one of you.
think, yes, whiteness is again one of those that is a very, I don't want to say sensitive topic, but I think you rightly, you alluded to it, right? I think the experience of the other, right, in the past, and the experience, it was deeply, it's a deep experience, deeply entrenched. And I, in fact, like the words of speaking with Gigi as well, that it's traumatic. And I mentioned in my presentation that somehow in church, sadly, even in our theological engaging with this identity issue, we sadly do not do enough to realize how traumatic the experience of whiteness has been on those who've been oppressed in any way, shape, and form, right? And so with regard, there is, I think, yes, a level of intolerance to power, to superiority, and to anyone that sort of want to impose. So in some ways, we talk here at home out there, arm's length, that I think Black people, and I'm using this now inclusively, are having, especially when it comes to them finding their own voice, finding their own faith, articulating their own story, and even in our theological spheres and spaces. I think for us, to a large extent, we still say much of our theology, our training, our formation, it is shaped by white theology. And not to say white theology is wrong, but it is saying there is not yet enough Black theology and whatever Asian or Latin American theology in the world, that we are all sharing as a global church and as a global space. So I think, yes, in that regard, from my experience and in the circles, I don't think there's a complete resistance to say we disregard white theology, but I think they are now in a space where majority world is just actually saying, no, we are finding our space now to theologize ourselves, to articulate it ourselves, to write it ourselves, to speak about it ourselves. And yes, because we have had no voice, we have been muted in that regard over a long period of time. So I think that is the reality a bit more from my perspective of engagement. I don't know, Gigi.
Yeah. So when we talk, I know Pass the Mic very well, that community, and I know the people that run it personally. So the thing about when we talk about white theology, right? And really it comes back to this idea of muting. When we talk about whiteness, it's a social political construct. It is a construct. The idea of whiteness only exists in relation to creating the idea of Blackness. That's how whiteness started, was by first creating the idea of Blackness so that we could enslave Blackness. Therefore, we have to be the polar opposite. Therefore, there has to be whiteness and Blackness, right? And I think the distinction that a lot of people of color in faith communities are more recently making, that I am going to do a lot less of reading theologizing by white-bodied siblings, there's a very important reason for that. When we talk about theologizing by white-bodied siblings, you're talking about people who are existing in society who have the worldview of looking from the top down, because that's your social location. And therefore, what happens is we read scripture through the lens of the top down, but the most dangerous part is most of the time we don't realize it. Mm-hmm. We do not realize how deeply intertwined our theological beliefs and assumptions are with colonizing ideologies. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's dangerous, because we don't realize it, therefore we don't acknowledge it. And because mainstream theology came from Western European-based theological leanings, it comes through the lens of colonizing practices and colonizing ideologies, which is dehumanizing and controlling. But the problem is we don't see that. we have created the standard, and again, I'm using the proverbial we, I'm a brown woman, but I want to use inclusive language because we are all a part of a collective.
Yeah.
And so we have created a standard where the standard of rightness is white theology. That's the standard of what's right. And unfortunately, because there is not a recognition or acknowledgement that it is deeply intertwined with colonizing belief systems and practices, there is not an understanding of the harm that it is doing. So therefore, I did my bachelor's and my master's in predominantly white institutions. When I chose to do my doctorate, I made a very clear decision. I am not going to have further theological training in a predominantly white institution. I am going to an HBCU in the US. That means historically Black college and university. I went to Howard University School of Divinity. And when I tell you what I experienced there was night and day different than what I experienced at the predominantly white seminary that I went to. It was night and day different. But unless our white-bodied siblings are actually willing to learn from majority world people of color as an equal, you won't realize the harm that is being done by making your opinions the standard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gigi and Trizenia, for unpacking the layers of problems and issues that are connected with the power dynamics and linked with categorization of people in terms of their colors and their caste and their context, I would say, as well, and where they are situated. Thank you very much. And also to those who have participated with your comments and by asking questions that drew out more discussions. Thank you very much. And with that, we end today's lecture.